So we've been talking about reproduction and different types of genetic replication that different types of organisms use for reproduction. So we talked about in prokaryotes how they use binary fission. We've talked about eukaryotes can use both mitosis and meiosis to replicate. And if you recall, for both prokaryotes that use binary fission and eukaryotes that use mitosis, in both of these processes, ultimately you have parent cells producing genetically identical daughter cells. So these daughter cells that are produced by binary fission are genetically identical to the parent cell. The daughter cells that are produced by mitosis are genetically identical to each other and to the parent cell. And ultimately, this process of binary fission is used by prokaryotes to reproduce asexually, and this process of mitosis is used by eukaryotes to reproduce asexually. And ultimately, these result in genetically identical offspring, unless some mutation occurs, okay? And so these processes are in contrast to this type of genetic replication that's used exclusively by the eukaryotes that's called meiosis. So in meiosis, genetically unique daughter cells are created. So you start with this parent cell and you get genetically unique daughter cells that are haploid and oftentimes genetically different from one another. And so this process of meiosis is exclusively used by eukaryotes, and it's used by eukaryotes to reproduce sexually. So anytime you have sexual reproduction, you've got to be doing meiosis. And once again, this is going to create genetically unique offspring. So how does it create genetically unique offspring? So in other words, in sexual reproduction, you've got this process of meiosis and fertilization occurring. And so this is a simplified diagram of how sexual reproduction works. And so how do meiosis and fertilization create genetic variation beyond just mutation alone, which also does happen during sexual reproduction? It's just that this process of meiosis and fertilization build on top of the genetic variation created by mutation alone. And so we talked about several different processes, one being independent assortment during meiosis that results in different allele combinations in the gametes that are produced by meiosis. We talked about mixing of these gametes. So you have these gametes that have different chromosome combinations, different chromosome versions, therefore different allele combinations that can result in different allele combinations by combining different alleles during this fertilization process. And we also talked about this process of crossing over that happens during meiosis, where individual chromosomes, the sister or the homologous chromosomes will exchange genetic material. And so all of this stuff adds up to create offspring with unique combinations of chromosomes, therefore unique combinations of alleles, and overall enhanced genetic diversity in the population for natural selection to work on. Okay, so this last point that I want to talk about here is that when we talked about mixing of gametes, so this process of fertilization that's behind this box right here, when we have mixing of gametes from two unrelated individuals, sometimes you can actually have gametes come together from individuals that are related, or sometimes even the same individual. So it's not always unrelated individuals that gametes are mixing from during this process of fertilization. And so sexual reproduction doesn't always involve two individuals. So typically when we think of sexual reproduction, we think of what are called dioecious organisms. So dioecious translates roughly to two houses. In other words, one type of gamete is produced by each sex. For example, in humans, we're dioecious, where we have males that produce sperm, we have females that produce eggs. So we have two different types of gametes produced exclusively by two different types of individuals. And therefore, you have two different sexes. And you can see that in plants, too. They're often dioecious, where you'll have a male plant that produces male flowers and sperm, and you'll have a female plant that produces female flowers that have eggs, okay? So in contrast to this dioecious setup, you can also have what are called monoecious organisms. These are also sometimes referred to as hermaphroditic organisms. And so what these are, so monoecious means one house, is basically you can have both types of gametes produced in the same individual. So for example, you can have a hermaphroditic flower that produces both eggs and sperm, or you can have an individual plant that has some male flowers and some female flowers. So some produce sperm, some produce eggs, but essentially these are genetically identical. And for example, we see hermaphroditic animals as well. So for example, some snails can be hermaphroditic, where they have both male and female parts and can produce both sperm and eggs. And there's other animals outside of snails that can do that as well. And so because of this ability of some organisms to be monoecious or hermaphroditic, there's different types of fertilization. So when we're talking about fertilization, anytime that you've got fertilization involved, you're always talking about sex. So there's different types of sex that exist in nature. Some sex involves self-fertilization, and other sex involves cross-fertilization. So in self-fertilization, essentially you're fertilizing yourself. The same individual is fertilizing themselves. So one individual produces sperm, and those sperm go on to fertilize an egg that individual has produced. So sperm fertilizes egg made by the same individual. And this is in contrast to cross-fertilization, where you have a sperm from one individual fertilizing an egg from a different individual, okay? So self-fertilization versus cross-fertilization. Self is within the same individual, cross is between individuals, but in both cases, this is an example of sex. Anytime that there's fertilization, there's sex. So, quick question. Between choices A, B, and C, what type of fertilization is possible for monoecious or hermaphroditic organisms? So can they do self-fertilization, cross-fertilization, or can they do both? And then what type of fertilization is possible for dioecious organisms? So remember, dioecious organisms are one where you only have males and you only have females. Go ahead and answer that. Okay, so if you said that monoecious or hermaphroditic organisms are capable of both self-fertilization and cross-fertilization, you would be right. So they can self-fertilize, but they can also potentially cross-fertilize. And that's because you can have another plant just like this that's across the way, and you can have some male sperm from this plant fertilize a female flower from that plant. Just like you could have some sperm from this hermaphroditic snail fertilize an egg from this non-hermaphroditic snail, just as an example, okay? So monoecious or hermaphroditic organisms can do both self-fertilization and cross-fertilization, whereas dioecious organisms only capable of cross-fertilization, okay? So if you're a dioecious male plant, you can't fertilize yourself. You can only cross-fertilize a female plant because you only make sperm, and sperm need to find eggs to fertilize. And only this other plant has the eggs, and vice versa. Okay, so given that we have these different modes of eukaryotic reproduction, let's talk about how this affects genetic variation. So if we look at the different modes of eukaryote reproduction, you can have asexual reproduction in eukaryotes by mitosis, like budding that we see in yeast. So remember, yeast is a fungus, that's a eukaryote. We can have sexual reproduction via self-fertilization, where you have a hermaphroditic individual or a monoecious individual that produces both sperm and egg. And so this is still sex because sperm and egg are coming together in fertilization. Or you can have sexual reproduction via cross-fertilization, where you have one individual producing a gamete that's fertilizing the gametes of another individual. Okay, so let's look at how those different types of reproduction affect genetic variation. So an example of asexual reproduction might be vegetative reproduction like we see in clonal trees. So you have this aspen tree like we talked about in the previous lectures, where it produces a bunch of genetic copies of itself through asexual reproduction, and this is called vegetative reproduction. So this creates the least amount of genetic variation in the population and genetic variation in offspring. And that's because in this case, this is all mitotically reproduced offspring, and because it's through mitosis, the only source of variation is random mutation that occurs during this mitotic process of cell replication. Mutation is very rare. So this will have the least genetic variation in comparison to these other two types of reproduction. So let's look at sexual reproduction via self-fertilization. So an example of this might be a hermaphroditic snail, where one individual produces sperm and then also produces eggs and fertilizes itself. So this creates more genetic variation than just asexual reproduction, because along with mutation that can happen during this process of gamete production, there can also be independent assortment during the production of sperm and eggs, as well as crossing over during the production of sperm and eggs. And so you can have a lot of variation in the allele combinations that are put together in these sperm and eggs, even though they're self fertilization happening. You get more genetic variation here than you would here because of these sources, independent assortment and crossing over during the production of sperm and egg. So lastly, let's look at sexual reproduction via cross-fertilization. So if we're talking about cross-fertilization, an example of this might be people. So when a male sperm fertilizes a female's egg. So you get sperm produced by this male and egg produced by this female. Sperm and egg come together to make offspring. And this creates the most genetic variation relative to sexual self-fertilization and asexual reproduction. And that's because you have all of these sources of genetic variation. So in this case, you've got males that are producing sperm, females that are producing egg. When those gametes are produced, there's going to be independent assortment, crossing over, and potentially mutation being introduced during meiosis. And on top of that, because you have separate individuals, these separate individuals potentially have very different pools of alleles in the first place. So on top of independent assortment, on top of crossing over, and on top of the mutation that can occur in each individual to produce the egg and the sperm, you can also have mixing of different alleles from these different individuals on top of all of these other sources. So this creates the most genetic variation of any of these types of reproduction. Okay, so as a summary, eukaryotes, they can potentially reproduce asexually. There's some that can do this. They can reproduce sexually by self-fertilization if they're monoecious, and or they can reproduce sexually by cross-fertilization. And there's many eukaryotic species that can do this as well. And remember, it's only eukaryotic organisms that can reproduce sexually. Prokaryotes cannot reproduce sexually. Okay, so given that, which type of reproduction of these three choices above uses meiosis? All right, if you said F is the correct answer, only B and C, so only sexual by self-fertilization and sexual by cross-fertilization use meiosis, that would be correct. So anytime that you're having sex, you're going to have to do meiosis. So remember, this is a generalized figure representing how sex works. When you have fertilization occurring, so whether it's self-fertilization or cross-fertilization, you have gametes coming together. That's the process of fertilization, creating this diploid zygote. For this process to continue without doubling the number of chromosomes each single time, you've got to have meiosis going on. So anytime that you've got sexual reproduction, anytime that you've got fertilization going on, by definition, you've also got to have meiosis occurring, whereas asexual reproduction only requires mitosis. Okay, next. Of these choices, asexual, sexual by self, sexual by cross, which type produces the least amount of genetic variation and which type produces the greatest amount of genetic variation in the population in offspring? All right, so if you said asexual produces the least, that would be correct. And that's simply because there's no meiosis occurring in asexual reproduction. It's only mitosis. And if there's no meiosis occurring, therefore there's no crossing over, there's no independent assortment, and there's no fertilization occurring. And therefore there's way less mixing of alleles. The only way that you get any genetic variation produced in asexual reproduction is if mutation occurs during mitosis, and that's very rare. Whereas cross-fertilization, so sexual reproduction by cross-fertilization, is going to have the greatest amount of variation produced because it has crossing over, independent assortment, and mixing of alleles from different individuals that potentially have very different pools of alleles in the first place. Okay, so I want to go back and just recall this summary table of asexual reproduction versus sexual reproduction. So earlier you should have already filled in this table. So now let's fill in this side of the table for sexual reproduction in terms of what is it, who can do it, prokaryotes versus eukaryotes, examples of it. So give me a couple examples of sexual reproduction or the different general types of sexual reproduction. What processes are involved, binary fission, mitosis, or meiosis, and how is genetic variation created? What are the three main ways that genetic variation is created? So go ahead and answer or fill in those question marks on this table. All right, and these should have been your answers. So sexual reproduction is when two gametes provide information to make genetically unique offspring, and it requires fertilization. Only eukaryotes can sexually reproduce. Prokaryotes can't do it. The two main types of sexual reproduction is you can have self and cross-fertilization. When we talk about the processes involved, Meiosis is the process that has to be involved in sexual reproduction. If it's a unicellular eukaryotic organism that's reproducing sexually, it can get away with just meiosis. However, if that organism that's sexually reproducing is multicellular, when you've got that zygote that's formed, that's one cell, that zygote has to make a bunch of copies of itself to make that multicellular organism in that multicellular life stage. And to do that, mitosis is required. And then lastly, how is genetic variation created during sexual reproduction? Well, these things that happen during meiosis, independent assortment, crossing over, and then mixing of gametes from different individuals that occurs during fertilization. And remember, you're only going to have it from different individuals if you're doing cross-fertilization as opposed to self-fertilization.